The shuttle descended through the orange clouds of Prime, and Commander Jake Harris watched the endless desert stretch out below like a burnt canvas. Sand dunes rolled across the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional jagged rock formation that up from the ground like broken teeth. This was not a welcoming world. This was a world that wanted everything on it to die. Jake turned to look at his small team. Lieutenant Maria sat across from him, her dark eyes fixed on her as she reviewed everything they knew about the species. Sergeant Pete checked his equipment for the third time, not because he was nervous, but because that was simply what Pete did. He was a man who believed in preparation above all else. 30 seconds to landing, the pilot announced over the intercom. Jake took a deep breath and stood up, gripping the overhead rail as the shuttle shook through atmospheric turbulence. They had trained for this moment for 2 years. First contact with an alien species was not something humanity took lightly, especially when that species had a reputation for violence and conquest. The Empire had been expanding across this sector of space for nearly 300 years. They had conquered 17 inhabited worlds and enslaved or destroyed every species that stood in their way. When human exploration vessels first encountered patrol ships, the galaxy held its breath. Everyone expected war. Everyone expected humanity to become the 18th conquered world. But they had done something unexpected. They had agreed to talk. Jake did not know why they had agreed. Maybe they were curious about this new species that had appeared so suddenly on the galactic stage. Maybe they saw an opportunity for easy conquest through diplomacy rather than war. Maybe they simply wanted to understand what they were dealing with before making their move. Whatever the reason, Jake was here now, and he intended to make the most of this opportunity. The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump, and the rear ramp began to lower. Hot air rushed into the cabin immediately, carrying with it the smell of dust and something else, something sharp and metallic that Jake could not identify. He squinted against the bright orange sunlight and stepped out onto the landing pad. The outpost rose before them like a fortress made of black stone and polished metal. Towers stretched toward the sky, and armed guards stood at every entrance. Jake counted at least 30 soldiers visible from where he stood, and he knew there were probably 3 times that number hidden from view. But his attention was drawn to the figure standing at the base of the main tower, waiting for them. Commander was everything the intelligence reports had described and more. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her body covered in dark green scales that seemed to shimmer in the harsh sunlight. Her eyes were golden and slitted like a serpent, and they tracked Jake's every movement with predatory focus. She wore ceremonial armor that left her powerful arms bare, and twin blades hung at her hips. Jake walked toward her with his team following close behind. He kept his pace steady and his posture relaxed. He had read everything available about body language, and he knew that showing fear was the worst thing he could do. Watched him approach with an expression that might have been amusement or contempt. It was hard to tell with a face so different from a human one. "You are the human commander," she said when Jake stopped a few feet away from her. Her voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "I am First Blade of the 7th Fleet, Conqueror of 4, Champion of the Sacred Arena." Jake politely, "Commander Jake Harris, thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a hawk might study a mouse. "Your species is new to the stars. We have watched you spread across your little corner of space, building your colonies and your stations. You are soft creatures, fragile. I have seen your kind bleed from the smallest wounds." "We do blade," Jake agreed calmly. "Most living things do." This seemed to surprise her. She had expected him to defend humanity's strength, to boast and posture as warriors did. His simple agreement threw her off balance for just a moment. "Come," she said finally, turning toward the tower. "We will discuss your purpose here, though I already know what you want." Jake followed her into the outpost, with Maria and Pete close behind. The interior was cooler than outside, but still uncomfortably warm by human standards. The walls were decorated with weapons and trophies from 100 conquered worlds, and Jake recognized several species that had been wiped out entirely by expansion. They entered a large circular chamber where a stone table sat at the center, surrounded by officers who watched the humans with open hostility. Took her place at the head of the table and gestured for Jake to sit across from her. "You come to beg for water," stated flatly once everyone was seated. "Your survey teams have found nothing on this planet's surface. Your ships require resupply, and you know that we control the only aquifers for 10 light years in any direction." Jake did not deny it. "Water is certainly something we would like to discuss, but we are not here to beg." No leaned forward, her golden eyes gleaming. "Then what are you here to do, human? You have no fleet strong enough to challenge us. You have no weapons that could breach these walls. You have nothing to offer except your submission." Maria spoke up from beside Jake, her voice calm and professional. "Actually, Commander, we have quite a bit to offer. Terraforming technology, medical advances, agricultural systems that could increase food production by 300%. Made a sound that might have been a laugh. We have no need of such things, they take what we require. That approach has worked well so far, Jake said quietly. But conquering worlds is expensive. You lose soldiers, you damage infrastructure, you create enemies who will resist you for generations. We are offering something different: partnership, trade, mutual benefit." Stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see the other officers shifting uncomfortably. They did not understand why their commander was even listening to this small, weak creature. "You speak boldly for one so fragile," said finally. "Perhaps you are braver than you look, or perhaps you are simply foolish." She stood abruptly, and the meeting was clearly over. "We will speak again tomorrow. For now, my guards will show you to your quarters. Try not to die from the heat overnight. I would hate to lose my entertainment so quickly." Jake rose and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that clearly puzzled. As the guards led them away, Maria leaned close to Jake and whispered, "That went better than expected." Jake smiled slightly. "We are just getting started." The next morning came with a sunrise that painted the desert in shades of red and gold. Jake stood at the window of his quarters, watching the soldiers perform their morning drills in the courtyard below. They moved with brutal efficiency, their blades cutting through the air as they practiced killing strikes. Every motion was designed to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. Pete joined him at the window, holding 2 cups of water from their own supplies. He handed one to Jake and took a sip from the other. "They have been at it since before dawn," Pete observed. 3 hours of combat training without a single break. Jake thoughtfully, "They want us to see this. They want us to understand what we are dealing with." "Is it working?" Jake smiled slightly. "Not the way they hope." Maria entered the room a few minutes later, her clutched in her hands. She had spent most of the night analyzing everything she could observe about thee and their outpost. Her eyes were tired but excited. "I found something interesting," she said, setting thee on the table. "Look at these water consumption records I managed to pull from their public systems." Jake and Pete gathered around as Maria scrolled through the data. The numbers were staggering. They consumed nearly 4 times as much water per individual as a human required. Their large bodies and high metabolisms demanded constant hydration, and the desert environment of Prime made this need even more extreme. "They are rationing," Maria explained, pointing to specific entries. "See these reduced allocations over the past 3 months. Their supply lines are strained. They are struggling to maintain adequate water levels for the garrison." Pete frowned. "So when said we came to beg for water?" "She was projecting," Jake finished. "She assumed we were desperate because she is desperate. Her people need water more than we do." This changed everything. Jake had come to this planet expecting to negotiate from a position of weakness. He had been prepared to offer concessions and accept terms just to establish a relationship with the... But now he understood that the situation was more balanced than anyone had realized. There were proud warriors who had built their empire on strength and intimidation. They could never admit weakness to anyone, especially not to a species they considered inferior, would rather die than confess that her outpost was struggling. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. A guard stood in the hallway, his expression as hostile as every other they had encountered. "Commander summons you," he announced flatly. "She wishes to test your worth." Jake exchanged glances with his team before following the guard through the winding corridors of the outpost. They emerged into a large arena that had been carved from the bedrock beneath the fortress. Hundreds of soldiers sat in tiered seating around the circular pit and stood at the center, waiting. "Welcome, humans," she called out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I have given thought to your proposal of partnership, but do not make alliances with the weak. Before we can consider your offer, you must prove that your species deserves our respect." Jake stepped forward calmly. "What kind of proof do you require?" Gestured broadly at the arena around them. "This is the sacred arena where warriors test their strength against one another. Combat, endurance, survival. These are the qualities we value above all else." She fixed her golden eyes on Jake. "Your sergeant carries himself like a fighter. Let him face one of my warriors in single combat. If he survives, perhaps we will continue our discussions." Pete straightened beside Jake, ready to accept the challenge, but Jake held up his hand. "I appreciate the offer, Commander, but we did not come here to fight. We came here to talk." A murmur of surprise and contempt rippled through the watching soldiers. Tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You refuse. You show your belly like a frightened creature." "I show nothing except common sense," Jake replied evenly. Fighting your warrior proves nothing about humanity's value as a partner. If my sergeant wins, you will say he was lucky. If he loses, you will say we are weak. Either way, nothing changes. Stepped closer, towering over Jake by nearly 2 feet. She could have killed him with a single blow, and they both knew it. Then perhaps you should fight me yourself, little human. Show me the courage your words claim to possess. Jake looked up at her without flinching. No. The arena fell completely silent. No one had ever refused a direct challenge from. Her record in the sacred arena was perfect, 37 victories against the finest warriors the Empire had produced. She was a living legend among her people. And this small, soft human had just told her no. You mock me, growled, her hand moving toward one of her blades. I respect you, Jake corrected. I respect you enough to tell you the truth. Fighting me accomplishes nothing for either of us. I am not a warrior, I am a diplomat. My strength lies in other areas. What strength? Demanded. What could a creature like you possibly offer that would impress the... Jake smiled slightly. Patience, endurance, the ability to survive in places where we should not be able to survive. He gestured at the harsh environment beyond the arena walls. Your intelligence reports told you that humans are fragile, and compared to, perhaps we are, but we did not conquer our home world by being the strongest creatures on it. We won by being the most stubborn. Stared at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, though Jake could not tell if it was anger or curiosity. Very well, human, you refuse combat, then we will test your endurance instead. She turned to address her soldiers. Tomorrow the humans will join our patrol through the burning wastes, 20 miles through the deepest desert under the noon sun. If they survive, we will continue our discussions. She turned back to Jake with something that might have been a smile. Try not to melt, Commander Harris. The desert shows no mercy to the weak. Jake simply, we will be ready. As the guards escorted them back to their quarters, Maria moved close to Jake and spoke quietly. 20 miles through open desert at noon, their average surface temperature is over 50 degrees. That is nearly impossible for humans without specialized equipment. Jake looked at her calmly. Nearly impossible is not the same as impossible. Besides, I have a feeling their patrol will be struggling just as much as we will. Pete cracked his knuckles. Well, if we cannot fight our way through this, I suppose we will have to walk. Jake, already planning their approach. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow is going to be interesting. The patrol began at dawn, but by the time the sun reached its peak, the desert had become a furnace. Heat shimmered off the sand in waves, creating mirages that danced on the horizon. The sky was a pale orange blanket that trapped the warmth and pressed it down upon everything below. Jake marched alongside his team at the center of the patrol column. 12 warriors surrounded them, each one carrying weapons and supplies for the 20-mile journey. Led from the front, her powerful legs eating up the distance with long, steady strides. The humans had prepared as best they could. They wore light clothing that reflected the sun and carried their own water supplies in insulated containers. Jake had also made sure they applied a reflective cream to any exposed skin, a simple trick that reduced heat absorption significantly. But even with these preparations, the heat was brutal. Jake felt sweat soaking through his clothing within the first hour. His throat grew dry despite regular sips of water. His legs burned as they pushed through soft sand that seemed determined to swallow every step. Maria walked beside him, her breathing steady, but she was smaller than either Jake or Pete, but she had trained extensively for harsh environments. Her focus remained sharp even as her body protested. Pete brought up the rear, positioning himself between the humans and the soldiers following behind. He had not spoken a word since the patrol began, conserving his energy for the journey ahead. By midday, Jake began to notice something interesting. They were struggling. Their large bodies generated enormous amounts of heat, and their scales, while excellent protection against weapons, did little to help them cool down. Several soldiers had begun to slow their pace, and Jake spotted one stumbling slightly before catching himself. Stopped the patrol at the base of a large rock formation that provided minimal shade. They immediately gathered in the shadow, drinking deeply from their water containers. Jake watched them consume far more water in a single break than his entire team had used all morning. You survive, observed, approaching Jake where he stood in the direct sunlight. She seemed surprised and perhaps slightly impressed. Most species collapse long before reaching this point. Jake shrugged casually. It is uncomfortable but manageable. We come from a planet with similar environments. This was not entirely true. Earth's deserts were harsh, but Prime pushed the limits of human tolerance. However, Jake had no intention of showing weakness now. Studied him with those golden serpent eyes. You do not seek shade, You stand in the sun while my warriors hide from it. Shade is nice, Jake admitted, but we have learned to function without it when necessary. Human history is filled with people who crossed deserts far larger than this one. Maria stepped forward, seizing the teaching opportunity. Our ancestors traveled thousands of miles across burning sand to find new lands. They did it without advanced technology, without proper supplies, sometimes without enough water to last the journey. Many died, but enough survived to keep going. Made a thoughtful sound. Your kind embraces death so easily. We embrace life, Jake corrected. Sometimes holding on to life means pushing through things that should kill us. It is not about being unafraid of death. It is about wanting to live badly enough to keep moving when everything tells you to stop. The patrol resumed after a brief rest, and Jake noticed that had positioned herself closer to the human team. She was watching them now with something other than contempt, curiosity perhaps, or maybe the beginning of respect. The afternoon brought even worse conditions. The temperature climbed higher and the wind picked up, throwing sand into their faces and reducing visibility. 2 soldiers fell behind, unable to maintain the pace. They were not abandoned, but they were clearly struggling in ways the humans were not. Jake kept walking. His body screamed for rest, for shade, for cool water that did not taste like dust. But he had learned long ago that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. He focused on the next step, then the next, then the one after that. Maria had begun counting her breaths, a meditation technique that helped her ignore physical discomfort. Pete simply walked, his expression blank and unreadable, his legs moving like pistons that would not stop until they reached their destination. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the outpost finally came into view in the distance. They had walked nearly 20 miles through some of the harshest conditions the galaxy could offer, and all 3 humans were still standing. Called the patrol to a halt just outside the fortress walls. She walked slowly along the line of her soldiers, noting which ones had struggled and which ones had maintained their strength. Then she approached the humans. "You completed the march," she said simply. "We did," Jake agreed. His voice was rough from dust and dehydration, but his eyes remained clear and steady. "My warriors trained their entire lives for such endurance. You are scientists and diplomats. How is this possible?" Jake smiled slightly, though his cracked lips made it painful. "Because we had to. Humans do not have scales to protect us. We do not have claws or fangs or natural weapons. We survived on our world by being too stubborn to die when everything wanted to kill us." Was silent for a long moment. The other had gathered nearby, watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to anger. Their commander was treating these weak creatures almost like equals, and they did not understand why. "Come," finally said, "we will continue our discussions, but first you will share water with me. It is tradition among warriors who have endured hardship together." She led them into the outpost, past the guards who no longer looked at the humans with quite as much contempt. Something had shifted in those 20 miles. The humans had not defeated them in combat. They had done something potentially more impressive. They had refused to fall. In private chambers, she poured water from a ceremonial container into 3 bowls. The liquid was clear and cool, precious beyond measure on this desert world. "This is herd water," explained, pushing a bowl toward Jake. "Sacred to our people. We share it only with those we consider worthy." Jake looked at the bowl, then he understood the significance of this gesture. Accepting the water would mean accepting a place of among the. It would advance their diplomatic mission significantly. But he also understood something else, was still testing him. She wanted to see if he would grab at this offering eagerly, revealing the desperation she still believed humans must possess. Jake pushed the bowl back toward her gently. "I appreciate the commander, truly, but I am not thirsty right now. Please drink it yourself." The silence that followed was absolute. Maria and Pete exchanged worried glances, uncertain what Jake was doing, stared at him with an expression that might have been shock or fury or something else entirely. "You refuse my water?" she asked quietly. "I decline it with respect," Jake replied calmly. "I have my own water. I do not need yours. Save it for someone who does." Looked at the bowl sitting between them, then back at Jake. For the first time since they had arrived, she seemed genuinely uncertain of how to proceed. "We will speak more tomorrow," she finally said. "This conversation is not over." Jake rose to leave. As they walked back toward their quarters, Pete leaned close. "That was either very brave or very stupid." Jake smiled slightly. "Sometimes those are the same thing." 3 days passed after Jake refused the sacred water, did not summon them for further discussions. She did not issue any more challenges or tests. She simply went silent, and the humans were left to wait in their quarters with nothing but their thoughts and observations. Maria used the time productively. She had gained limited access to the outpost's public information systems, and she spent hours studying culture, history, and biology. What she learned only confirmed their earlier suspicions. The empire was built on conquest, but conquest had become increasingly difficult. Each new world they took required soldiers to hold it, water to supply it, and resources to maintain it. Their expansion had slowed dramatically over the past century, not because they had run out of enemies, but because they had run out of capacity. Prime was supposed to be a solution. The underground aquifers here contained more fresh water than a dozen average planets combined. They had seized this world specifically to secure their water supply for generations to come. But something had gone wrong. The aquifers were proving more difficult to access than expected. Drilling equipment failed in the extreme heat. Engineers struggled to design pumping systems that could withstand the harsh conditions. And the rationing that Maria had observed was not a temporary measure. It was becoming permanent. "They are dying," Maria told Jake on the third evening. "Not quickly but steadily. If they cannot solve their water problem within the next decade, this outpost will have to be abandoned. And if this outpost falls, their entire supply line collapses." Pete grimly, "No wonder was so hostile when we arrived. She thought we were here to exploit her weakness." "We need to change her perception," Jake said thoughtfully. "She needs to understand that we are not predators looking for easy prey. We are neighbors who might actually be able to help." The next morning, Jake requested a meeting with. To his surprise, she agreed immediately. He found her alone in the same chamber where she had offered him the sacred water, sitting at the stone table with her ceremonial blades laid out before her. "You wish to speak," she said without greeting, "so speak." Jake sat across from her, studying her face for any hint of her thoughts. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture seemed different somehow, less aggressive, more retired. "I want to tell you a story," Jake began, "a story about my species." Raised one scaled eyebrow but did not interrupt. "Thousands of years ago, my ancestors lived in a place called the Fertile Crescent. It was a land of rivers and green fields, surrounded by harsh desert. They built great cities there, some of the first cities in human history." He paused, gathering his thoughts, watched him with those golden eyes, waiting. But the rivers changed course, the rain stopped falling, the green fields turned to dust, and the cities began to die. My ancestors could have fought each other for the remaining resources. Some of them did, but others chose a different path. "They fled like cowards," asked with a hint of her old contempt. "They adapted," Jake corrected. "They learned to live with less water. They developed new farming techniques that required less rain. They dug wells deeper than anyone had dug before. And eventually they built systems to move water from places that had it to places that needed it." Jake leaned forward slightly. "They did not conquer the desert, Commander. They learned to work with it. They learned that sometimes survival means changing yourself instead of changing everything around you." Was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Jake had ever heard it. "Why do you tell me this story?" "Because I think you are facing a similar choice," Jake replied gently. "The old ways are not working anymore. Conquest brings more problems than it solves. Your empire is stretched thin, and your people are struggling even here on a planet you were supposed to control completely." His claws scraped against the stone table, leaving shallow grooves. "You know nothing of our struggles. I know that your water rations have been cut 3 times in the past year. I know that your drilling equipment fails, then you can repair it. I know that your supply ships arrive half empty because other outposts need resources too." Jake paused. "I know that you are a proud warrior who has never lost a battle, facing an enemy you cannot fight with blades." The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Jake could see emotions warring behind his eyes, pride and fear, and something that might have been hope. "What do you propose?" she finally asked. "Partnership," Jake said simply. "Real partnership, not the kind where one side pretends to cooperate while waiting for a chance to betray the other. Humans have technology that can help you access those aquifers safely. We have terraforming capabilities that could turn parts of this desert into farmland within a few years." "And what do you want in return?" "Friendship, trade, a neighbor we can trust instead of an enemy we have to fear." Jake spread his hands. "We are new to this part of the galaxy, Commander. We need allies just as much as you need water, but allies you choose are worth more than subjects you conquer." Stood abruptly and walked to the window, out at the endless desert beyond. Jake waited, knowing that this moment could determine the future relationship between their two species. "My entire life," said slowly, "I have been taught that strength is the only thing that matters. The strong take what they need, the weak serve or die. This is the way of the way we have always been. She turned to face Jake, but strength has limits. Even the warrior cannot defeat thirst, cannot defeat heat, cannot defeat an enemy that has no body to strike. Some enemies require different weapons, Jake agreed. Moved back to the table and picked up one of her ceremonial blades. For a tense moment, Jake wondered if she was about to attack him. Instead, she laid the blade flat on the table between them, pointing toward herself. "This is a gesture of trust among my people," she explained. "The blade points toward my own heart, not yours. It means I am willing to be vulnerable in your presence." Jake respectfully, "I understand the significance." "Do you?" Fixed him with an intense stare. "Your species confuses me, Commander Harris. You are soft and small and weak in every way I was taught to measure strength, yet you completed a march that broke some of my own warriors. You refused sacred water without fear, as if you truly did not need it. You sit before me now and speak of friendship instead of demanding concessions." She shook her head slowly. "Either you are the greatest fool I have ever met, or there is something about humans that my people have completely failed to understand." Jake smiled slightly, "Maybe both." Despite herself, made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was the first time Jake had heard anything like from her. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will begin real negotiations, not tests or challenges, real discussions about how our peoples might work together." She picked up the blade and sheathed it at her hip. "But tonight you will join me for a meal. I would learn more about this species that survives through stubbornness." Jake stood and "I would be." As he left the chamber to gather his team, Jake allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had not won anything yet. The negotiations ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since arriving on Prime, he felt like genuine progress was possible. All it had taken was refusing to fight. The formal negotiations began the following morning in the main council chamber. Had assembled her senior officers, a dozen scarred veterans who had conquered worlds and crushed rebellions across the Empire. They looked at the three humans with expressions ranging from to barely concealed hostility. Jake had expected this. Changing the mind of one commander was difficult enough. Changing the minds of an entire military hierarchy would take much longer, but he had been given an opportunity and he intended to use it. The discussions started with technical matters. Maria presented detailed plans for aquifer access systems that could withstand the extreme conditions of Prime. She explained how human drilling technology used cooling mechanisms that they had never developed, allowing equipment to function in temperatures that would destroy conventional machines. The engineers in attendance asked sharp questions, probing for weaknesses in her proposals. Maria answered each one with calm precision, backing up her claims with data and simulations. By the end of her presentation, even the most skeptical officers were nodding thoughtfully. Pete followed with a security assessment, outlining how human and forces could work together to protect shared infrastructure. His military background gave him credibility with the warrior culture, and his practical approach appealed to their sense of efficiency. But the real turning point came during the afternoon session, when raised a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Your technology is impressive," she acknowledged. "Your proposals are sound, but I still do not understand your motivation. The way is to take what we need. Your way seems to be giving things away and hopping for something in return. How does this serve your interests?" Jake had been waiting for this moment. He stood slowly, drawing the attention of everyone in the chamber. "Commander, officers, I want to tell you something about human history, something that might help you understand why we approach things differently." He began to pace slowly, his voice steady and clear. "Humans are not the strongest species on our home world. We are not the most deadly or the most armored. By every physical measure, we should have been prey for larger predators." The officers exchanged glances. This was not the kind of boasting they expected from a species trying to impress them. "But we survived," Jake continued. "We thrived. We spread across every continent on our planet, adapting to jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands, and eventually we reached the stars." He stopped packing and faced directly. "How did we do this? Not through conquest, not by defeating every enemy we encountered. We did it through cooperation, through building alliances with other groups who had strengths we lacked, through trading knowledge and resources instead of fighting over them." Jake moved to the center of the chamber. "The Empire has conquered 17 worlds, impressive by any measure, but how many of those worlds actively contribute to your strength? How many provide soldiers and resources willingly, rather than under the threat of force?" Silence followed his question. The answer was obvious, even if no one wanted to say it aloud. Conquered peoples did not become willing allies. They became problems that required constant attention and resources to manage. Humans have a different philosophy, Jake said. We believe that a partner who chooses to stand with you is worth 10 subjects who are forced to kneel. We believe that trade creates more wealth than theft. We believe that enemies can become friends if you give them reason to. One of the senior officers, a grizzled warrior with scars covering half his face, spoke up. Pretty words, but words do not win wars. No, Jake agreed, but wars can be avoided entirely if both sides have more to gain from peace than from conflict. He turned back to, your empire is struggling, not because your warriors are weak, but because conquest has limits. You cannot conquer water, you cannot conquer heat, you cannot conquer the simple fact that holding territory requires more resources than taking it. Slowly, this is true. Humans are offering you a different path, not submission to us but genuine partnership. We help you solve problems you cannot solve alone. You help us establish ourselves in this region of space. Both sides benefit, both sides grow stronger. Jake pulled out his water container and held it up for everyone to see. It was still half full, despite the days of harsh conditions he had endured. You thought we came here desperate for water. You thought we would beg and plead and accept whatever terms you demanded. But we brought our own supplies, we have our own resources, we do not need anything you have. He set the container on the table in front of, we are offering help because we want to, not because we have to. That is the difference between a partner and a beggar. Stared at the water container for a long moment. Then she reached for the ceremonial vessel of herd water that still sat in the corner of the chamber, untouched since Jake had refused it days ago. She poured a bowl and pushed it toward Jake. Drink with me, Commander Harris, not as a test, not as a gesture of submission, as equals who have chosen to share water because we want to, not because we must. Jake looked at the bowl. This time the offer was genuine. This time accepting meant something different. He picked up the bowl and drank half, then set it back on the table and slid it toward. She took the bowl and finished the rest, a gesture of shared commitment that clearly moved the watching officers. But Jake was not finished. He reached for his own water container, the one he had carried across 20 miles of burning desert, and poured its contents into an empty ceremonial bowl. Fine, suit yourself, he said with a slight smile, pushing it toward. Consider this a gift from one partner to another. Stared at the bowl of human water, her golden eyes wide with something Jake had never seen from her before. Shock, genuine, complete shock. You give us your water, your own supply. We have more on our ship, we have the technology to make more wherever we go. Water is not our weakness, Commander, it never was. Jake leaned forward, and now it does not have to be yours either. Lifted the bowl slowly and drank. When she set it down, her expression had changed completely. The suspicion and hostility that had defined their early interactions were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. I have conquered worlds, she said quietly. I have defeated the greatest warriors of a dozen species. I have never been defeated in single combat. She shook her head slowly. But I have never encountered anything like you, Commander Harris. You have won a victory today using nothing but words and water. I am not entirely sure how to feel about that. Jake smiled. Feel like a partner, that is all I ask. The negotiations continued for 3 more days, but the hard work was already done. The details were complicated, involving terraforming rights and trade agreements and military cooperation protocols. But the foundation had been laid in that moment when Jake gave away his water, proving beyond any doubt that humans were not the desperate creatures that had believed them to be. 6 months later, the first human terraforming ships arrived at Prime. Within a year, 3 new aquifers were operational, providing more water than the outpost had ever possessed. Soldiers trained alongside human engineers, learning maintenance procedures they had never imagined. And Commander, First Blade of the 7th Fleet, became the first officer to publicly advocate for partnership with humans. She often told younger warriors about the day she learned that strength came in many forms. Sometimes she would say, the weapon is an open hand. The story spread through the Empire, carried by soldiers and traders and diplomats who had witnessed the changes on Prime. It became known as the Water, and it marked the beginning of a new relationship between 2 very different species. All because one small, soft human had refused to beg. And then gave everything away anyway.